Good morning, everybody. It's good to see everybody. I am going to ask that we, if you're willing to put your camera on, I would appreciate it. I want to speak to that real quickly before we get into the lesson. And this is absolutely meant to be encouraging. And if anybody takes it differently, please reach out to me because that's not my intent. And this is just my own personal opinion. Two things happened. Two things happened recently. So yesterday, I've got the privilege of being involved with a youth lectureship down in Texas. I was supposed to be there in Texas, but instead it's gone virtual. So they asked me to pre-record a message. And so yesterday, I've done this 100 times, right? Sit in front of a camera and speak. It was a 35-minute message, and it took me 2.5 to 3 hours to record it because it's not the same when you're not there, when it's just the camera and it's not real people. So part of that is it just reinforce the connection that I need as a speaker. Maybe I'm being a little selfish there, but I think we need as Christians to be together, to see each other. And then number two, last week when we were worshiping in Knightsville, and some of you know Betty Eaton. I was talking to Betty Eaton, and we were talking about the whole virtual, and she said, look, she said, one day I woke up and I realized, wow, this is really easy. This is nice, to get up, roll out of bed. You don't have to get all dolled up and everything. And you just walk downstairs, log on, and there you are. And then she goes, that's when I realized I need to get back to physically meeting. When all of a sudden she was appreciating the convenience and some of the things that yes, it's a big blessing to have this virtual format. And this isn't a comment about whether you're ready to get back to physically worshiping or not. It's more just a comment on that desire to be together, to be physically together. And so my point is this is not camera shaming anybody. I know there's different situations in different places, and I'm not judging, and I'm confident nobody's judging whether or not your camera's on. But I personally get a benefit from seeing you at least a little bit, whether it's at the end or during. And as a speaker, I definitely get a benefit from having faces that I get to see, right? Even if when I make a comment, the facial reaction is delayed just a little bit because of our feed, I still gain a lot from that. So as last time, I've got, just so you know, I'm sitting here, I'm not looking at my face, I'm looking at all your faces. I really, really appreciate it. But again, I'll restate, I hope I'm not discouraging anybody. I know you've got different situations, different things going on at home with a whole lot of different things to handle and obstacles. So if your camera's off, that's fine. That's not my point. But if you can put it on, I think it does benefit us in multiple ways. So there's my soapbox for this morning. Now let's jump on another soapbox. So go ahead and turn to John chapter 4. John chapter 4 is where we're going to start. And I want to make sure that I highlight something that Josh said in his prayer. He prayed that the speaker would help us see Jesus. I don't know that there's any higher purpose you can have as someone who gets to present the word of God than to help others see who Jesus is. And that I hope is our intention all year as we're talking about being image bearers. We are in the month of August now. It seems like where's the time go? But month of August, we begin a whole new subject. We're looking at worshiping, the idea of worshiping. Specifically, we've got 3 lessons designed. So this morning, we're looking at Jesus, the worshiper, and I may have taken some liberties on what I'm presenting in that aspect. Next Sunday, Lord willing, Brett Hancock will be looking at worshiping in our church family, in the church family. And then the following Sunday, Fred Schnarr, Lord willing, will be looking at lives of worship, both in the family and in the world. So Jesus, the worshiper, worshiping in the church family, and then lives of worship. That's where we hope to go. And then the last 2 Sundays of the month are a little flexible, but most likely Al Diesel Camp on the 23rd will be presenting something as it relates to peacemakers. And on the 30th, we're going to have somewhat of a review is the plan right now, based on we're sort of at the halfway point. Hopefully college students will be joining us again. And that's the plan. Let's talk about worship. So when we think about worship, and this is not the design for my lesson, I don't know what Brett and Fred have planned exactly, but the design for my lesson is not to describe and to explain and to get nitty gritty on what worship is as far as Greek words and all that. I did do some of that study. I've done some of that work, and it seems to be 3 major words that are often translated as worship. One of them is the idea to it literally comes from 2 words, to kiss towards, or to towards and to kiss. The idea is to pay homage, falling down. We would, the idea is to pay homage, to fall down. Kissing the feet is the idea, right? So kissing the feet of a superior. That's one word very commonly translated as worship. Another one of the most common is the idea of to fall down and to fall on your face or to bow down. We see that a lot of times, especially in the Old Testament, when someone would realize they're in the presence of an angel, and what would they do? They'd fall on their face. We saw that with, we see that in different throne scenes where they're overcome and they fall on their face. So that's the prostrate yourself. And then there's also a word translated worship that often is also translated serve. And the idea of to serve, and your spiritual service of worship is the idea to serve in homage to something. Regardless of which word, and in chapter 4 here of the Gospel of John, it's that first one, that to toward, the two words toward and to kiss. That's what this word for worship is. But regardless, they're all connected with showing reverence. They're all connected with holding something in high esteem. They're all connected with honoring. Okay, so whether it's talking about falling down on your face, or whether it's serving, or whether it's kissing the feet of that imagery, the idea of worship is there's something to be revered. There's something to be honored. And how does both our conduct and our language and our physical stance or demeanor is the better word, our physical demeanor shows that we're honoring and reverencing that. Okay, so that's a real brief. There's a lot more you can do, but that's just a brief idea. So what I want us to get in mind is not to get nitpicky about, well, what's it exactly mean, but this idea of how do I show reverence and honor and awe? Okay, how do I pay homage to something that deserves it? And then another aspect of worship that I've heard talked about from time to time, which I'm not going to get into. I don't know about Brett and Fred, but oftentimes we maybe intentionally, but I think more often it's unintentionally, we box worship into just what we're doing now, or even more traditionally into what we used to do at the building. You're going to worship, which that's an accurate statement. We are going to worship. But worship can get boxed into just this time when you're together in this formal setting with other Christians. And if you look throughout the Bible, there are plenty of examples of both what you might call corporate worship, when we're coming together as a group to worship, but there's also plenty of examples, I would dare say more examples, when it is just us individually worshiping, paying homage to, showing reverence to our God. So my point is this is not to like separate those out, but to say worship involves both. Worship involves all that. And then the last thing I'll say before I truly get into the text for this morning is, and I want to be careful with this because I don't want to offend anybody, but sometimes in our effort to simplify the gospel, we lessen the gospel. Okay, I think Mike talked about that a little bit, and I'm not going to get his words exactly right, but when during our last 2 years of study, one of the things he talked about was, if sometimes the gospel has been boiled down to a lot of us is just going to church and trying hard not to sin, right? And I think in an effort to simplify and we want simple answers, but that really limits the gospel. Another thing, and some of you this may be foreign to you, but some of you'll immediately get this reference, but sometimes we talk about the 5 acts of worship. And there really is a biblical basis for what we do when we're together, right? There's examples and things of that nature. And I'm not criticizing that thought pattern, but sometimes if that's how we think of worship, is these acts of worship, these specific 5 acts of worship, and then once I've A, B, C, D, E, and I don't know if that's enough. Once I've 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's what I should have done. Once we've hit that, well, we've worshiped. And that's putting worship in a box, I think, right? Not that any of those things that we have examples of doing together to worship God, those are all biblical things. Those are all things that please God. But sometimes if that's the way we think, we're putting worship in a box that God never intended it to be. I hope that makes sense. And obviously, you all have my phone number and email if you have other thoughts or suggestions. Quite frankly, you have the opportunity to unmute yourself right now and disagree wholeheartedly if you want. Let's look at the book, the Gospel of John. So here's what I'm doing. And at the risk of completely derailing Brett Hancock's sermon and Fred's sermon, I'm going to focus completely on John chapter 4, which really is, when you talk about Jesus speaking about and giving clarity of worship, John chapter 4 is the quintessential passage. So that's why I even thought about this yesterday when I was preparing. I said, you know what? I might really be stepping on Brett and Fred's toes, but hey, you know what? Flexibility. You got to adjust, right, guys? They're more than capable of moving forward. John chapter 4 is interesting because it starts out with something. I probably should actually have my Bible there too if I'm asking you to turn there. John chapter 4 starts out with something for that day and time that's really, really strange. Especially if you get down to verse 7, it says, "There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, 'Give me a drink.' And the disciples were gone." And in verse 9, "Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, 'How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink since I am a Samaritan woman?'" Okay, so first of all, and I'm not going to go off on this tangent, but racism is nothing new, right? I mean, here you have a Samaritan woman who is spoken to, or a request from a Jewish man goes to the Samaritan woman, and you get this idea of shock. She's like, "What? How?" First of all, okay, water aside, you're talking to me? You don't talk to me. I mean, the Samaritans were looked down as dogs, and not even just Samaritans, but the culture and where women stood in that place. I mean, this was just this whole situation that we're going to be looking at started out different. It started out against cultural norms. It started out outside of what society would think is acceptable. Okay, that's important to understand. Okay, this whole dialogue starts with something that's not right based on society's view of what's right. Okay, now we're not going to read all the text, but Jesus talks about the water, and he turns it to a different discussion. He goes, if you, instead of dealing with the whole racism issue, he says, if you knew who you were talking to and what I was offering you, you'd be asking for living water. And then there's this confusion and this discussion, and it comes down to where he says, "Go call your husband," right? And Jesus is very intentional. And she goes, "I don't have a husband." He goes, "You're right." And he basically tells her something about herself that he shouldn't have known. And this is where we're going to really pick up in verse 19 of chapter 4. He said, the woman said to him, so after he says, "Truly you've had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. This you have said truly." And her response is, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." So because she doesn't know him, because he knows more about her than he should know, she says, "There's something about this guy. He must be a prophet." She says, "Sir, I perceive you're a prophet." Now look at where she goes next. So because she perceives him as a prophet, and this is the logic that I run through, he's going to have some information, right? So there's a burning question that she has. And because now that he's demonstrated he's someone who has some knowledge that he might be a prophet, let's ask him this question. Now look what her question is in verse 20. "Our fathers worshiped in this mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is a place where men ought to worship." Okay, this question, or what she brings up, this subject, I think is vitally important to understanding what happens next. Because this is the context of Jesus's response. Okay, the context of Jesus's response is she perceives he has some information, he might be a prophet, and she says, "I want to know. Our fathers say, our fathers worshipped in this mountain here in Samaria." And we can even trace back when all that started, right? "But our fathers worshipped in this mountain. You say, Jews, you say you got to worship in Jerusalem." And the idea is, which one's right? Now, I want you to know, so what she's starting with is location. Where's the right place to worship? Now, there's a whole lot of underlying things, right? Like, am I wrong if I stay here in Samaria? But that's what our fathers did. And maybe there's an underlying thought of, does God hear us if we're worshiping here versus in Jerusalem? Or is there a right or a wrong place to worship? I think underlying whether or not she knows she's asking this or bringing this up, underlying that is the idea of exclusion, isn't it? Because it's not just about location. It's like, is our worship being excluded, or is our worship for nothing because we're not in Jerusalem? So there's also this underlying exclusion. If we want to get really deep, and I think Jesus alludes to this, or what he's doing is turning on his head, it really brings into question the entire old law structure of worship. Because there were do's and there were don'ts, and there was, you go here at this time and you participate in this feast and that feast. And so just this one question sets the context for all of this one statement by her question really sets the context for all of Jesus's remarks. As she's asking about location, I think underlying is this idea of exclusion, who's excluded from worship. There's this whole underlying premise of the law and how it is that you approach God and how God can or cannot be worshiped. I think there's this underlying idea of access to God, isn't there? That's an aspect of that whole question. That's important to understand. That's what Jesus is responding to. Okay, so let's read his response. And it's a response that I think some of us might be quite familiar with, because as I said, it is the quintessential passage of Jesus talking about worship. Let's go ahead and begin in verse 21. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, and such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth." Okay, so in response to this discussion or this question about location, which I have implied also goes to exclusion, it goes to access, it goes to the structure of what does God accept? How do you access God? How do you approach God? Which hers is focused on location, but I think it introduces a much broader concept than just, is it actually this mountain or this mountain, right? Jesus says, what we generally sum this passage up into is, you got to worship in spirit and truth. Right, now we're going to explore those two things in just a minute, but I want to start with what Jesus says in verse 23. Yes, 23. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers. Okay, think about that for a second. In this response, Jesus identifies that there are true worshipers, which implies what? That there are fake worshipers. I don't know what words you want to put. Fake, false worshipers. There are insincere worshipers, but there's definitely a true worshiper. The word itself, that word for true, is simply genuine or real, right? There are genuine worshipers, and they're in other stuff. All right, turn real quick. We're going to come right back to John chapter 4, but turn real quick with me to Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15. This is just one aspect that I want us to consider, because this is that, and the reason I bring this up first is, as we consider this text, as we consider what Jesus says about worshiping, where do you want to be? Where do you want to be? A true worshiper, right? A genuine worshiper. Right? I think we all would say, yes, I absolutely want to be a genuine worshiper. I want to be one of these true worshipers that Jesus is speaking about. Look at Matthew chapter 15. This chapter begins with the Pharisees criticizing Jesus' disciples because they break the tradition of the elders, verse 2. And then Jesus focuses on how they nullify the law of God for their own tradition, and this whole thing with honoring parents. Look what he says in verse 6. "And by this you invalidated the word of God for the sake of your tradition. You hypocrites, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men." In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. Okay, so we absolutely, there can be a vain worship, right? There can be a less than genuine worship, a false worship. And the traditions, and here's the thing, even though Jesus is getting on the Pharisees here, and we know that they have a history of by their fruits, you can sort of see that their motives aren't pure in general. There's exceptions to that, right? You think of Nicodemus and others, right? But the reality is that you can have a tradition, and it can be a very sincere tradition. It's a tradition from a very good place that becomes ingenuous worship, fake worship, right? It can be vain worship. And I'm not going to go into this. Go on back to John chapter 4. But one of the words for worship is interesting, is often translated devout, but specifically, like in, I think it's Romans 1:25, it's the idea of worshiping in a perverse manner. But it's tied to the idea of devout. So people can be devout in their worship, sincere in their worship, and still be wrong, right? So my point is, as we dissect a little bit this text in John chapter 4, is our goal this morning is to, at the end, is for us to say, I'm a true worshiper. This is what Jesus said was a true, genuine worshiper. And to do that litmus test, to use Josh's words, to show us Jesus, and then to see, do I look like that, right? So that's the idea. So let's go ahead and start. And I'm going to get right out of the gates and challenge maybe some of our, at least my traditional thinking. I shouldn't always lump you guys into what's going on in my head. That's a scary thing. My traditional thinking. Oftentimes, as I've approached this text, and I've heard others do this as well, so I know it's not just me, but we take spirit and truth and we very quickly say, truth is doctrinal. It's the truth. It's the way God wants to be worshiped. And we say spirit is the heart and the emotion, right? I'm going to push on. I'm not saying those are wrong. And I think there's other places where that's absolutely, we pull that in and that's completely accurate. But let's keep in context how Jesus responds. Because remember, what question is he answering? He's answering her question about location. Now, he broadens it out, but it's location. And I've also submitted to you that in that question of location, this mountain or that mountain, it also comes to who's excluded, who's not excluded, access towards God. It's bringing into question the entire old law to a certain extent. So Jesus says, "Woman, believe me," verse 21 again. "An hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." We're going to get back to that, I promise. Verse 22. "But an hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth." Okay. It says true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. So my premise is we want to be true worshipers, then the very first thing we've got to understand is Jesus says true worshipers worship in spirit and truth. So we need to know what that means, right? If I want to be a true worshiper, I got to know what it means to worship in spirit and truth. In spirit and truth, for such people, the end of verse 23, for such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Verse 24, in my opinion, is what gives us the insight into what Jesus is talking about. Okay, she sets forth this idea of location. Is it here or is it here? His response is God is spirit. His response is saying God's not contained in physical form. Do you see that's in response to her question? He's digging at God is spirit. Why are you trying to send God to that mountain or to this mountain? Go quickly to Acts chapter 7. I hope some of you probably thought about this passage as well, right? Acts chapter 7. Remember, Stephen, he's giving his defense in Acts chapter 7. And notice what he does. Now, first of all, what he does is brilliant because he answers their accusations, but he does it in a way that just lays out the facts for him. But if you remember at the end of chapter 6, I want you to see the accusation in verse 13. He says, "This man incessantly speaks against this holy place," they're talking about the temple, "and the law, for we heard him saying that the Nazarene Jesus will destroy this place," that's the temple, "and alter the customs which Moses handed down." So one of the accusations he speaks against the temple. Look where Stephen addresses that. Look at verse 47 of Acts chapter 7. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. However, the Most High does not dwell in houses made by human hands, as the prophet says, "Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool, is the footstool of my feet. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what place is there for my repose? What was it not my hand which made all these things?" All right, so in response to he speaks against his place, Stephen says, is he contained within this physical structure? The earth is his footstool. God's hand made it all. He's quoting and he's saying, he goes, God's not contained. And going back to John chapter 4, I think what Jesus is saying is God's spirit. You can't contain God to one physical location or the other. Now, there's more to that as well, I think. I don't think he's just saying it's not this mountain or that mountain. He's calling into question this whole access and this whole structure of worship. There's what they traditionally see as worship. Which if we understand, knowing our Jewish history, understanding the prophets, is that the Jews did a really good job of taking the law of God, stripping the heart from it, and turning it into a list of do's and don'ts. And then the list of do's and list of don'ts, they started interpreting and adding to. So it really became this checklist of things, didn't it? Now, the saddest part is the Pharisees were holding people accountable to this checklist, but they weren't even living by it themselves. It was this burden that people just couldn't even bear. And so Jesus, as he answers her this question about location, his foundation is God is spirit. Why are we thinking about worship in a physical mindset? Why are we thinking about worship as far as location specifically? Or I would even say temporal versus eternal. And in fact, I would say his response, and as we think about what does it mean to truly worship in spirit? What does it mean to truly worship in spirit? It's in contrast to this ritualistic going through the motions, checking box A, B, C, D that the Pharisees had turned it into. Because the root of her question, because there was an answer to her question from the old law, why there was worship set up the way it was in Samaria is because there was rebellion, right? It wasn't right. But what Jesus is saying is you're looking at this all wrong. God is spirit. And those who worship him must worship in spirit. Now let's quickly go on to truth. He says spirit and truth. Go ahead and turn to 1 John chapter 3. Oftentimes, when we think of the idea of worshiping in truth, our minds can go very doctrinal in nature. And I do believe that's part of it. So don't hear what I'm not saying, that means you do whatever you want. No, there is absolutely, and there's plenty of evidence throughout the New Testament. Jesus himself says, I don't speak of my own initiative. I speak what the Father gives me to speak. There's this whole pattern. If we read through the Old Testament and the New Testament, and we really come away with thinking that, you know what, as long as my heart's right, I can do whatever I want and God's going to be pleased, then we're reading a different book, right? So don't get me wrong that I'm saying you just do whatever you want. But in this context, I think the way he's using truth is more in line with what 1 John, which is that idea of accurately worshiping God as he is requested or is commanded. But look at 1 John chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3. Again, I tend to do this where I start talking and I've asked you to turn somewhere and then I'm not even anywhere close. So forgive me, bear with me while I turn my pages. 1 John 3, let's start in verse 16, okay? We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. Okay, so let's follow this real quickly. John starts out with, we know love because Jesus gave. He physically laid down his life, okay? We ought to do the same thing. Now, I love where John goes because he doesn't keep it at this big, grand, I will lay down my life for Karen Lawson. I can say that, right? But what's ever the likelihood that Karen is really going to need maybe my kidney or my heart, or I'm going to have to take a bullet for it? It's easy to say. In reality, it's not going to happen. But is there a situation where I have what Karen needs physically, and in money, food, shelter? Then I'm showing whether I'm willing to lay down my life. That's the idea, right? Notice what he says in verse 18. This is really what we want to focus on. Let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. Notice he's contrasting deed, the action, and truth with just saying it but not meaning it. In this context, the idea of truth is sincerity, which it doesn't eliminate accuracy and fact and all those things, but the idea is in deed and truth. In other words, the truth of my heart, the sincerity of my heart. Paul does the same thing in Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, if you remember, he's talking about people who are preaching the gospel of Christ in order just to be a pain in his side. And in Philippians chapter 1, look where he contrasts what he contrasts with truth. Philippians 1, verse 18. What then? Only in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. Pretense, for show, for appearance. And he contrasts pretense, for show or appearance, with truth, with sincerity, that the reality of what is on the outside matches the reality of what's on my inside. So let's go back to John chapter 4 with that idea of truth in mind. Yes, and again, don't focus on what I'm not saying. Absolutely, we worship God as he has commanded. We absolutely come to God with how he's instructed us to worship and what he wants us to do and how to participate together in worship and all we read all that. But what Jesus, in my opinion, is saying is with truth, sincerity. In other words, what's on the outside matches up with what's on the inside. Because think about the context. What is the standard of worship in their day? It's mimicking in a different way, but it's mimicking exactly what we saw the law and the prophets talk about all the time, the prophets especially. How many times did the prophets talk about your sacrifices, your new moons, your feasts? They're disgusting. They're despicable to me because your heart, and I'm summarizing, your heart isn't there, right? So this idea of spirit and truth is understanding that we are coming to a God who can't be contained in a building. There's aspects of, and yes, there's aspects of the spirit, I think, with this inner man, the whole being. Let's not take God and box him into this one little physical idea that we have, right? Let's understand who God is, and we must worship him as he is. We must worship him with our whole self, and in truth, with complete sincerity. It's not about the ritual. It's not about the checking the box. Does that mean that when we're together here or physically again, that all of a sudden everything changes? No. We're still going to sing. We're still going to pray together. We're still going to do those things. Does it mean that in what I do in my own personal worship changes necessarily? No. It may not change on the outside is my point. But the idea is, do I understand that I can worship everywhere and at all times, and I've got to stay away from trying to contain God into this physical idea of what worship is, into this traditional ritualistic, and I have to worship in complete truth. That where the outside, what people can see when we worship together, when we worship, matches the sincerity of what's inside, the genuineness of what's inside. Okay, and recognize that Jesus says they must worship. And if we want to be a true worshiper, we must worship in spirit and truth. Real quickly, I want to make two more observations from this text, and we're going to be done. Real quickly. Okay, notice, and I'm going back now to, I probably should look at my notes, make sure I'm there. Okay, notice, let's go back to verse 22. He says, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father. Okay, notice when she says in verse 20, our fathers worshiped in the mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Notice she doesn't even bring up the Father. And I'm not saying that she doesn't have God the Father in mind, but she doesn't bring it up. Notice Jesus multiple times focuses on who we worship. I know this is like an odd does type of statement, but who we worship is very narrow, isn't it? If we're going to be a true worshiper, it's not just about spirit and truth, but it's about where is our devotion. Remember when Jesus was tempted in Matthew chapter 4 specifically, what was one of the temptations? I'll give you all this if you just bow down and worship me. And what was his response? He quoted. He says, the Lord God is who you worship, and him only. Right? Let's not lose sight that worship, true worship, is focused in one specific direction. Now, that's easy to say, and we all will shake our heads and we agree. But what other things in our life do we give too much reverence to? What other things start to take God off the pedestal and put politics, finances, various human relationships, even healthy human relationships? Today is 23 years of marital bliss. I say that. Christine might say there's a few years of not quite bliss in there. There are, but 23 years with my bride today, right? Beautiful. I call it, we're entering the Michael Jordan year of our marriage, right? 23. She is extremely important to me. In many, many ways, she's the center of everything with our family when it comes to so much, right? I can take that God-given, that blessing from God, I can take that relationship and I can put that as something that I start to worship, isn't it? Right? So when we say the Father, when Jesus points out the Father, let's just be clear. There is a very narrow focus of who we worship, who deserves that reverence and awe and homage and honoring, and as Jesus is speaking about, that spirit and truth worship. Next, notice what he did. He says, you worship what you didn't know. We worship what we knew. Okay, that's important. And this is something that we could spend all morning on, but we're not going to. But why is, and this is such a silly question. I wrote it down, and even as I wrote it down, it's silly. Why is God worthy to be worshiped? I could go family to family, camera to camera, and I could ask, and we could probably all come up, if our minds are working quick enough, we could come up with different multiple aspects, and we could just keep going all morning, couldn't we? All these aspects. Immediately we start thinking about his love and his grace and his mercy. We think about creation, his power demonstrating creation. I hope that we also think about his judgment and his wrath, right? Not that we want to fixate, but those are all aspects that he's worthy to be worshiped. His authority. We think about his kindness, his gentleness, his patience, his loving kindness. We think about his wisdom. We can go on. Why is God worthy to be worshiped? Do you know God? A true worshiper knows who they're worshiping. Okay, so it's not enough to just say, yeah, we worship God, but do we know God? Do we know who God is? And in knowing who God is, do we fall down in reverence and honor? Or is worship just become sort of ritualistic, something we do? I'm telling you, if I spend time contemplating, thinking about who God is in all his form and aspects and all his greatness, as much as my mind can comprehend it, if I think about that, my worship will be different, won't it? If I'm focusing on those aspects of God. I would dare say that's something that maybe if you want to start a text chain with the group while we're still somewhat physically separated, maybe you start by just sending somebody a text and saying, here's one aspect of God that makes him worthy to be worshiped. Keep forwarding it on. And let's just see how many times we can jump around reminding each other of why God's worthy to be worshiped. All right, last but not least on this, I want you to see what Jesus says at the end of verse 23. I'll go ahead and read all of verse 23. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be his worshipers. Let's not lose sight of that. God is seeking worshipers. He is looking for, he is interrogating, he's picking through the mess to find true worshipers. This speaks to a lot, but this speaks to our purpose, doesn't it? And we're not going to explore all this. Maybe Fred or Brett can get to this, but we were created to worship. We were created in our God's image to be in awe of who he is. Go ahead, and this is where we're going to finish. Turn with me to Revelation chapter 5. Revelation chapter 5. And this is the part that I'm sure some of you others who present lessons, you have these, as I'm working through this material and I'm studying it to understand it, and then and hopefully to understand it first and to present it second. But as I'm studying through this, when I got to this point, this is where the hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up. Because I'm thinking about what Jesus is responding to, and he's helping correct this woman. First of all, think of the kindness and grace and compassion Jesus is showing to this woman, first of all. But as he's taking her through these things, and by the way, and I'm not going to get here, and I've got too many tangents, he then reveals that he's the Messiah to her. It's an amazing interaction on many levels. But as he's going through this and explaining this to her, and I hope filling her with hope about what we are in this time where true worshipers and God is seeking true worshipers. As he's explaining that, as he's going through and hopefully expanding her mind, we can start to taste what heaven looks like. When we start to tap into true worship, when we are worshiping the true God of heaven, when we're contemplating who he is and how he's worthy to be worshiped, and it's not just in our actions which are obedient to how he's instructed us to worship, but our actions are completely supported by a sincere heart, a heart that is true, a heart that is full of love and respect and reverence for who we're worshiping, not just what we're doing, but why we're doing it and who we're focusing on. Recognizing that he is seeking that out. That when I'm worshiping as Jesus is laid out, he is finding me. It takes me to Revelation chapter 5. Specifically in chapter 4, you have this scene where the creatures are saying, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, day and night without stopping. And the elders throwing down and they say, worthy are you, right? Look at chapter 5, verse 11. Then I looked, and I heard the voice of many angels around the throne and the living creatures and the elders. Okay, go back to chapter 4. Chapter 4, the living creatures and the elders. See what they're doing, how they're responding. I see the living creatures and the elders, and the number of them was myriads and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, "Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing." And every created thing which is in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all the things in them, I heard saying, "To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and dominion forever and ever." And the four living creatures kept saying, "Amen." And the elders fell down and worshiped. Try with our limited ability to imagine what that's like. In the presence of God, myriads upon myriads, every living thing on the earth crying out in praise and honor because God is worthy. As we worship together, as we worship in our homes, as I walk out and see a sunset and I fall down and worship at the beauty of that sunset that my God gave me, as we worship in spirit and truth with a narrow focus of who we're worshiping and why he's worthy, it is one of the closest things we can do in this physical body to represent what's happening in heaven. It's one of the closest things we can do. And I hope that as we consider worship throughout this month, that we continue to go back to what that would be like. What's happening in heaven? What's happening around the throne? What one day we will be a part of, and that we get to taste it now as we worship our God.